This is the class Why Four Gospels. The topic is parallels and differences in meanings, and this is video 5, the final video on that topic. Now, the question I want us to think about is this: how are we to understand the miracle stories in the Gospels? I remember as a youth hearing a minister say at a youth revival, no one ever performed the miracles that Jesus did. Well, apparently that preacher had not read his Bible, because miracles are common stuff in the biblical tradition. From the perspective of the biblical writers, the world is not a closed system of nature that God must interrupt in some supernatural way in order to act. The world, according to that ancient view, the biblical view, the world functions as it does because God wills it to function that way. God can and does will it otherwise at times. The miracles in the Bible are understood from this perspective as signs and wonders, not as violations of natural law. In the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, the Christians' Old Testament, Moses performed miracles. Elijah and Elisha performed miracles. And many other miracles took place from time to time. The prophets envisioned miracles, which they described as signs and wonders, to be part of the last days when God's future reign is realized. In the New Testament, miracles abound. Sometimes miracles occur as a result of the direct action of God, and sometimes they occur through angelic instrumentation. Jesus, of course, performs miracles in the Gospels. The apostles perform miracles in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. Miracles occur also in these documents through ordinary disciples. Even bad or unfaithful disciples perform miracles, as well as non-disciples. False prophets perform miracles. In both the Jewish and non-Jewish ancient world, outside of the biblical tradition, miracles, just like in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament, miracles were understood to be in the realm of the possible and were an accepted part of the worldview of most people in that day and time. There were stories of miraculous deeds current among the rabbis and Jews of Jesus' day. In one story, a Jewish boy calms a storm at sea. In another story, bread is miraculously provided for the wife of a renowned rabbi. Stories exist about rabbis of Jesus' day performing healings and exorcisms and calming storms, miracles that occur in our Gospels. In the non-Jewish world of that day and time, there are stories of miracles performed. The Emperor Vespasian, for example, a contemporary of Jesus, is said to have healed the blind with his saliva and healed a withered hand with pressure from his foot. Philostratus, who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era, wrote a public biography of Apollonius, who was a philosophical wisdom teacher who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era. And in that story, there are a number of miracles, exorcisms, and healings performed by the wisdom teacher. Now, what all of this clearly demonstrates is that miracles were accepted and somewhat expected in the ancient world. It was not at all unusual for Jesus to perform miracles in the Gospels. What would have been unusual is if Jesus did not perform any miracles in the Gospels. In our New Testament Gospels, what matters is not that Jesus performed miracles. Miracles were a part of that ancient worldview. Nothing is unusual at all about Jesus performing miracles. What matters is the meaning that we assign the miracles. What matters is what the miracle signifies and what the miracle story proclaims about the meaning of Jesus, the meaning of the good news of Jesus. Now, this is important. The meaning of a miracle story in the Gospels can be accepted and appropriated by those who believe that the miracles actually happened and by those who don't. Affirming or rejecting that worldview, the historicity of a miracle, makes no difference at all, because the important thing is the meaning of the miracle story. It's what the miracle story signifies and teaches that is important. For example, let's reflect once again on the sea miracle, the first sea miracle, where the disciples fear the worst when their little boat starts to take on water and they struggle against the violent Sea of Galilee. Well, Jesus, if you remember, is asleep in the boat, and the disciples, fearing for their lives, wake him up. Well, Jesus wakes up, he rebukes them for being afraid, or he asks them why they are afraid, depending upon which version you are reading it and how you interpret it. And then Jesus rebukes the wind and the waves, and he brings calm. Now, as we have seen when we considered that story, the meaning of that story is discovered when we understand the symbolism of the story and when we read the story spiritually, metaphorically, and theologically, not literally. The raging sea represents the powers of chaos and the forces of evil and injustice that threaten to overwhelm those who represent the justice and goodness of God. And when Jesus rebukes the sea, that recalls Old Testament passages where God exercises power over the sea. And it echoes the many times in the Gospels where Jesus rebukes the evil spirits, where Jesus silences, muzzles the unclean spirits, and then casts them out. When Jesus so acts in calming the sea, he is acting as the representative of God, and he is acting in behalf of God. The gospel writers are proclaiming that Jesus, as God's Son, is God's agent for healing and liberation. Now, the story, the stilling of the sea, doesn't tell us how Jesus does that. It doesn't tell us what it looks like. It doesn't tell us what form God's healing and liberation may take. But it does tell us that Jesus is God's servant, that Jesus is God's Son, called by God to be God's agent of healing and liberation. That healing and liberation can take many different forms and find many different expressions. And in Mark's version of the story, where Jesus says, "Peace be still," which is unique to Mark, Mark is telling us that Jesus is the one who will usher in the anticipated and hoped for peace of the reign of God. In fact, Mark tells us that God is already here in the person and actions of Jesus. Now, this is the meaning of the story. And you can accept that meaning and appropriate the meaning regardless of what you believe about the historicity of the miracle, whether or not the miracle actually happened. The meaning of the miracle story is what matters, quite apart from the question about the actual historicity of the miracle. Now, I hope you hear what I'm saying in this discussion. I am not telling you that you have to give up your faith in the historicity of the miracles. If you believe that the miracles actually happened, or if you don't believe that the miracles actually happened, I'm not telling you that you have to believe that they happened or they did not happen. Because whether they did happen or whether they didn't happen, what is important is the meaning of the miracle story. And it is the meaning of the miracle story that functions to proclaim some aspect of the gospel, the good news about Jesus. Now, as I talked about when we looked at the first sea miracle and the second sea miracle in the Gospels, to get at the meaning, we have to interpret these stories metaphorically and symbolically. And the way we do that is the way we read the story the way we might read a parable or a sacred myth. The question of whether they actually happened or not is irrelevant when it comes to getting at the spiritual and theological meaning of the story. Whether you believe the miracle happened or whether you don't, you can understand and appropriate the meaning of the story.